A wife calls 911 at 2:17 a.m. Her husband is dead on the bedroom floor. She says a masked man did it, but there's one problem. The gun that killed him was hers, and it was found hidden inside her locked car, days after police had already searched it. The call came in at 2:17 a.m. on January 2nd, 2018. The dispatcher heard a woman's voice, remarkably composed for someone who had just witnessed a murder. Sandra Garner described a masked intruder who had entered her bedroom while she and her husband John slept. She said the man carried both a firearm and a flashlight, his face obscured, his voice unfamiliar. He knew her name. He told her that John had ruined his life by firing him from his job at the packaging plant. He said losing that position had cost him everything: his home, his family, his future. He told Sandra she would not be harmed because she had always treated him fairly when she worked in management. The man forced her to retrieve a fire safe from the bathroom area that contained roughly $18,000 in cash, money John reportedly kept on hand for emergencies. She handed over the safe. He ordered her to stay put and count to 100 before doing anything, warning that if help arrived too soon, there would be consequences. Then she heard 2 gunshots. When officers arrived at the Maypearl home, they found John Garner on the bedroom floor, shot multiple times, including at least once in the head. The house was quiet. The family dogs had not barked. Sandra was taken to the station for questioning and later underwent an emergency psychiatric evaluation. The case had begun. John Kevin Garner was born on November 1st, 1975, and he built his entire adult life across the warehouse districts of Northeast and North Texas. Public records contain almost no information about his childhood, no schools, no named parents, no early biography that survives in any reliable source. What is known begins in adulthood, in the world of packaging plants and logistics operations. By his late 30s, John had worked his way up to vice president of operations at Whipack Logistics in Paris, Texas. That title required years of experience running warehouse floors, managing employees, and making decisions that either kept a company on schedule or fell apart under pressure. John developed a reputation for being blunt and demanding. He did not hesitate to fire employees who were not performing to his standards. Over the years, he terminated a considerable number of people. That detail would matter more than anyone could have predicted. John met Sandra at that same packaging company. She was a manager in quality and sanitation. She was about 13 years older and had been married twice before. She was raising 2 children from those relationships, a son named Wesley and a daughter named Andrea. Something clicked between them despite the age gap and complicated history. 2 years after they met, they flew to Las Vegas and were married on New Year's Eve. Marrying Sandra meant stepping into her children's lives, and John did so with commitment. Wesley took to him almost immediately. He would later describe John as a second father, someone who filled a role that had been missing throughout his childhood. Andrea's relationship with her new stepfather started with more distance. She did not warm to him in those early years the way her brother did. That dynamic would change over time, but the initial adjustment was not smooth. From the outside, the marriage appeared stable and genuine. John and Sandra's home became a gathering place for family and friends. Jessica, who was married to one of John's cousins, spent considerable time around the couple and remembered them as looking genuinely happy. She assumed they would grow old together. Sandra herself would later describe John as an unusually sweet man, someone who did not match the tough reputation he carried at work. At home, she said, he was her partner in almost everything. They lived their lives side by side rather than as separate people under one roof. Sandra had also built a career of her own before her health declined. Years spent in management, handling quality, safety, and sanitation standards inside the same industry John worked in. That mattered later because Sandra was not simply a dependent spouse. She had once supervised staff and made workplace decisions herself. That made her eventual total reliance on John feel like an even greater reversal of fortune. In 2014, everything changed. Sandra was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. The disease slowly stripped away her independence. Her medication made her physically ill, and depression followed close behind. Sandra would later say that during this period she considered suicide. She felt like a burden and did not want John to spend the rest of his life caring for her. According to Sandra, when she told him this, John said that if she died, he would take his own life as well. Whether that conversation happened exactly as she described it, one fact became clear inside that marriage. John took on a new role. He became Sandra's caregiver and the household's sole financial provider. Andrea watched her stepfather step into that role, and it changed how she saw him. She came to view John as her mother's rock, the man who showed up, who did not leave, who handled everything when Sandra could not. Whatever distance had existed between them earlier began to close. In 2016, John and Sandra sold their home in Paris and moved to the small community of Maypearl in Ellis County. They relocated largely so they could be closer to relatives who could help as Sandra's health continued to decline. John's father and stepmother moved directly across the street. Sandra's own mother lived nearby in the same county. Other relatives visited constantly, often walking straight into the house without knocking first. The backyard became the unofficial gathering spot for the extended Garner family. This was not an isolated household. This was a home full of people who knew the routines and who may have known exactly where John kept his guns. John kept an extraordinary number of firearms. By Sandra's count, the house contained roughly 49 handguns and about a dozen rifles. They were deliberately scattered through different rooms so that a weapon was always within reach. John believed in being armed and ready at all times. Among that massive collection was one revolver he had given specifically to Sandra for her own protection, a Taurus .38 Special. The couple had also built real financial stability over their years together. They purchased a home worth roughly $260,000 and reportedly poured another $200,000 into improvements. A pool, solar panels, and upgrades throughout the property. They owned multiple vehicles outright, including Sandra's Mustang, a pickup truck, and a sedan. They kept a modest credit line and savings on top of it all. Investigators later learned that John drank heavily and had been taking prescribed antidepressants. One investigator would describe him as outgoing, blunt, and unconventional. A man who said what he thought and did not waste energy softening it. By the final weeks of 2017, John and Sandra had been married for almost 18 years. On December 31st, 2017, they celebrated their wedding anniversary. The next day, January 1st, 2018, Wes came by the house and spent part of the afternoon with his stepfather. Around 7 that evening, Wes left. As far as anyone has established, he was one of the last people besides Sandra to see John alive. Police searched the house that night along with the vehicles and outbuildings on the property. Sandra's Mustang, parked inside a detached garage, was checked as well. Nothing incriminating turned up. An autopsy was performed on January 3rd. The medical examiner recovered a projectile from John's body, and investigators found a second one lodged inside a pillow from the bed. Both were .38 caliber, consistent with Sandra's account that she had heard 2 gunshots. As officers dug into the case, they pulled records from the electronic devices inside the house. What they found was a search made on December 28, 2017, 4 days before the murder, reportedly around 11 at night, asking how to kill someone while they slept. Whoever ran that search had gone on to open an article listing different ways to kill a person without being caught. Investigators also swabbed Sandra's arm for gunshot residue. What they found was described as a very small amount, a few particles, but her hands had never been immediately bagged or protected after the shooting, which meant the result could be read almost any way. The case had landed on a small-town police department that was not built for it. Maypearl's police chief, Boyd Norton, was leading his very first murder investigation. He had taken preliminary photographs of the crime scene on his own cell phone shortly after arriving. Those photographs would later disappear entirely and never make it into evidence. The formal official crime scene photography was not taken until roughly 8 hours after the shooting, by which point emergency workers and officers had already moved through the house repeatedly. Ellis County investigators and a Texas Ranger eventually stepped in to help carry the case forward. For days, the missing Taurus .38 stayed missing. Then Wes told police something oddly specific. His mother used to keep that revolver tucked underneath the driver's seat of her Mustang. On January 5th, investigators went back to the garage. The car was locked. Sandra initially said police already had the keys. There was a tense back and forth before a spare key was produced and the car was open. Underneath the driver's seat, wrapped in paper towels and sealed inside plastic bags, officers found the revolver. On January 10th, the state crime lab confirmed what investigators suspected. The bullets that killed John had come from that exact revolver. That same day, Sandra Garner was arrested and charged with murder. Her bail was set at $2 million. It was later reduced to $1 million, and her attorneys argued it should come down further given her disability and her lack of any prior criminal record. An appellate court reviewed the arrest affidavit and allowed the reduced bail to stand. Sandra could not post it. She remained in custody as the case crawled toward trial. Her first trial date was pushed back when prosecutors requested more time for additional DNA testing. Her bond was lowered again to $500,000, but she still could not make it out. The trial itself finally began in September 2019. By then, Sandra had spent close to 21 months behind bars. Over the course of about a month, 25 witnesses took the stand, and prosecutors walked the jury through nearly 400 pieces of evidence. Sandra made the decision to testify in her own defense, a move even her own attorney was uneasy about. Under cross-examination, she struggled with several of her answers, particularly around the internet search. The prosecution framed those struggles as dishonesty. Her defense framed them as the product of trauma, illness, medication, and the passage of nearly 2 years. The defense spent much of the trial picking apart the physical evidence piece by piece. They pointed out that the revolver had not been in the Mustang during the first search and only appeared after West described exactly where to look. They noted that no usable fingerprints or DNA connected Sandra to the weapon itself. They brought up the earliest crime scene photographs taken on the responding police chief's own cell phone, which had since vanished and could never be produced as evidence. They highlighted that Sandra's hands had never been properly protected for residue testing. They emphasized that the car's exterior door handle was never fingerprinted and that the vehicle itself was not immediately secured or impounded as evidence. And they raised serious doubts about Wes, pointing out that his claimed alibi rested on timestamps that had been read in the wrong time zone. Even Chief Norton, under cross-examination, admitted to a string of mistakes. He said he should have removed Sandra from the house immediately, bagged her hands on the spot, and handed the investigation over to more experienced county investigators sooner than he did. Prosecutors, for their part, openly acknowledged during the trial that they had never landed on a single clear motive for why Sandra would have killed the man who supported her financially and physically. Texas law did not require them to prove one, but its absence hung over the entire case. After a month of testimony, the jury deliberated for roughly 3 hours. They came back with a verdict, not guilty. Sandra Garner walked out of custody a free woman, but freedom did not return her old life. John's family, who lived just across the street, had come to believe she was guilty, and the acquittal did not change their minds. Some of them reportedly celebrated the moment police first arrested her, believing justice was finally being done for John. Sandra moved back into the house where John had been killed, saying it was still the place she felt closest to him. But the family that once gathered in that backyard turned away from her for good. Her relationship with Wes, the son who had pointed police toward the gun, collapsed entirely. She came to publicly state that she believed he was responsible for John's death, though no evidence or court ever established that. She and her daughter Andrea remained close, but the extended family John had built around himself never came back together. Strip away the emotion, and this case comes down to a handful of physical facts. The murder weapon was conclusively matched to the bullets that killed John. That part of the forensic picture is solid, but ballistics can tell you which gun fired the shots. It cannot tell you whose finger was on the trigger. The revolver was recovered wrapped in plastic and damp paper towels, conditions that likely destroyed any fingerprints or DNA that might otherwise have survived. That means the single most important piece of physical evidence was forensically a dead end. Then there is the timeline problem. Police searched the Mustang on the day of the murder and found nothing inside it. The gun only surfaced during a second search days later after West described exactly where to look. Somebody placed that revolver under that seat sometime between search 1 and search 2, and nobody was ever definitively proven to be that person. On top of that sits a cascade of procedural failures. The police chief's earliest crime scene photos vanished. Sandra's hands were not bagged, making the gunshot residue test unreliable. The Mustang was not immediately impounded. The exterior door handle was never tested for fingerprints. The internet search was made on a device that other people in the house could access without a passcode. What makes this case genuinely unsettling is the emotional architecture underneath it. John had become Sandra's entire support system. That total dependency is exactly the profile of a relationship where losing that person would be catastrophic, which is the defense's central argument for why Sandra had no motive. But total dependency can also breed desperation, one rooted in feeling trapped inside an illness, inside a marriage, inside a body that no longer does what you need it to do. Neither theory can be confirmed. John Garner was murdered in his own bed with his own gun on the anniversary of his own wedding day. And to this day, the person who pulled the trigger has never been proven in a court of law.